The chief engineer's 1974 report sat in a filing cabinet. One word circled in red: Scour-Critical. Nobody read it. At 10:28 a.m. on April 5, 1987, 130 feet of interstate span dropped 4 cars and a tractor-trailer into the current below, killing 10 people in less than 3 seconds. The bridge engineers had spent 13 years convinced pier scour was a theoretical problem that would never materialize in New York. The families driving to Easter brunch discovered otherwise when the roadway simply vanished beneath their tires. Schoharie Creek cuts through Montgomery County, New York. Usually just 6 feet deep, shallow enough to drive a farm tractor through without getting the engine wet. On that rainy Sunday morning in April, it ran 25 feet deep, 10 feet above flood stage, moving at velocities that would strip trees from the banks and roll boulders downstream like marbles. The flow rate that morning, 62,000 cubic feet per second. A 50-year flood event. Water moving with enough force to excavate 9 feet of soil beneath a concrete pier in less than 12 hours. Upstream at the Blenheim-Gilboa Pumped Storage Power Project, 40 miles away, operators watched reservoir levels hit historic highs. 12 hours before the bridge fell, they opened the spillways. Water rushed down Schoharie Creek at rates the system had never recorded. They were adding to a creek already in flood stage, already carrying more water than the designers of the bridge had ever anticipated. Meanwhile, on Interstate 90, the New York State Thruway, Easter Sunday traffic moved at 70 miles per hour across a bridge that had been standing since 1954. 33 years of service. Hundreds of millions of crossings. Not a single structural concern noted in the most recent inspection, conducted exactly 1 year earlier on April 1, 1986. The inspection report gave the bridge passing grades. The inspector never looked at the foundations. He assumed they were secured by piles driven deep into bedrock. He was wrong. The bridge sat on shallow spread footings, resting on erodible soil, protected only by a layer of loose rock called riprap. Rock that was supposed to be maintained. Rock that hadn't been properly inspected in over 3 decades. Rock that was no longer there. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where the mistakes began. January 1952. The New York State Department of Public Works approved the final design for a 540-foot bridge across Schoharie Creek. The consulting firm Madigan Highland had submitted 2 proposals, one for a 600-foot crossing, one for 540. Both designs placed 2 concrete piers directly in the creek bed. Both relied on shallow spread footings bearing on soil. Both depended entirely on riprap protection to prevent scour erosion. The state chose the cheaper option. 540 feet. Money saved in the initial construction budget. The construction contract went to B. Perini & Sons, Incorporated on February 11, 1953. Construction began immediately. Madigan Highland performed construction inspection in conjunction with the Department of Public Works. The design specified 5 simply supported spans with nominal lengths of 100 feet, 110 feet, 120 feet, 110 feet, and 100 feet. Concrete pier frames would support the bridge spans along with abutments at each end. The pier frames were constructed of 2 slightly tapered columns connected by tie beams. The columns were fixed within a lightly reinforced plinth. The platform connecting the columns to their base, which was positioned on a shallow reinforced spread footing. The spread footing was to be protected by a layer of dry riprap. The superstructure consisted of 2 longitudinal main girders with transverse floor beams. The skeleton of the 8-inch thick bridge deck was comprised of steel stringers. Here's the critical part. The original design specified abandonment in place of steel sheet piling installed during construction to stabilize the construction site at piers 2 and 3. This would have protected those piers from scour. It wasn't done. The sheet piling was removed after construction. The as-built plans didn't reflect the true condition of the bridge. They showed sheet piling in place to protect the piers. It was gone. The bridge opened to partial traffic during summer 1954. Full service began that October. Almost immediately, problems appeared. In spring and summer 1955, vertical cracks formed in the concrete plinths. The cracks ranged from 3 to 5 mm wide, 0.12 to 0.20 inches. High tensile stresses in the concrete. The plinth couldn't resist the bending forces between the two columns. The original design had reinforcement only in the bottom portion of the plinth. The engineers had confidence that concrete in tension could resist the bending stresses without upper reinforcement. They were wrong. Later analysis determined the upper portion of the pier plinths experienced tensile stress of 1.4 megapascals, 200 pounds per square inch, and should have contained more than 39,000 square millimeters of steel in the upper face, upwards of 60 square inches. But here's what matters. Those cracks appeared less than 1 year after the bridge opened. Warning signs. Structural distress. Evidence that the design calculations were flawed. Then came October 16, 1955. A 100-year flood. 76,500 cubic feet per second roared down Schoharie Creek. The bridge survived with no visible damage. But investigators would later conclude the floodwaters had already begun undermining the foundations, scouring beneath the footings, removing protective materials, starting the erosion that would kill 10 people 32 years later. Engineers noticed other problems shortly after completion. Expansion bearings were out of plumb. Roadway approach slabs had settled. Roadway drainage was poor. The supporting material for West Embankment dry stone pavement was deficient. In 1957, workers added plinth reinforcement to each of the 4 piers. Steel bars to strengthen the cracked concrete. But the reinforcement wasn't properly anchored. It didn't extend through the columns. It couldn't be adequately tied into the existing structure without replacing the columns entirely. So they did what bureaucracies do. They patched the problem and moved on. All the problems mentioned and other minor issues were corrected by fall 1957. The cracks were sealed. The expansion bearings adjusted. The drainage improved. Everything looked fine. But beneath the waterline, where nobody was looking, the erosion continued. Here's where the institutional betrayal begins. The part of the story that makes your blood boil. Because people knew. Engineers understood the risk. Reports were written. Warnings were issued. They were filed away and forgotten. The 1974 report that sits at the heart of this disaster identified Schoharie Creek Bridge as Scour-Critical. A bridge where loss of streamed material at the foundation could cause collapse. The term wasn't casual engineering jargon. It was a classification. A warning label. A red flag that demanded enhanced inspection protocols and continuous monitoring. The report specified that Scour-Critical bridges required underwater inspection of foundations. Visual confirmation that protective riprap remained in place. Measurement of scour depth. Documentation of any erosion around pier footings. Nobody performed those inspections. Not in 1974. Not in 75. Not in 76, 77, 78, 79, or 80. Not in 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, or 86. 13 years. The report sat in a filing cabinet while traffic rolled overhead at 70 miles per hour. But it gets worse. Because this wasn't the only warning. In 1979, a consultant hired by the New York State Department of Transportation conducted an inspection. His report noted that most of the riprap around the piers was missing. Most of it. The primary and only protection against scour erosion. Gone. The report was filed. No corrective action taken. The New York State Thruway Authority inspected the bridge annually or biennially. The inspections were accomplished not by engineers, but by personnel whose primary responsibilities were in bridge maintenance. The Albany Assistant Division Engineer for Bridges was not a professional engineer. Let that sink in. The person responsible for evaluating the structural integrity of interstate bridges carrying tens of thousands of vehicles daily wasn't a professional engineer. The National Transportation Safety Board would later state in their investigation report, the inspections in the New York State Thruway Authority Albany Division were accomplished not by engineers but by personnel whose primary responsibilities were in bridge maintenance. One of those inspectors gave testimony to NTSB investigators after the collapse. He admitted he gave the footings passing grades even though he did not actually look at them. He assumed the footings were secured by piles. He never checked. He assumed. 10 people died because someone assumed. The bridge was scheduled for an underwater inspection in 1987, the year of the collapse. The inspection that might have revealed the scour holes forming beneath Pier 3. The inspection that might have closed the bridge before disaster struck. The bridge collapsed 4 months before that inspection was scheduled to occur. Spring 1987 was exceptionally wet for upstate New York and New England. Streams already swollen from rainfall and snowmelt from the previous week rose rapidly with new amounts of water. 3 separate storms moved through the region during the first week of April. Warm temperatures accelerated snowmelt runoff. On April 4th and 5th, intense rainfall totaling 6 to 9 inches fell over a 24-hour period in the Schoharie Creek watershed. This meteorological event saturated already moist soils and overwhelmed the local drainage system. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the 1987 flood along Schoharie Creek was the third largest since record tabulation began during the early 1900s. Only the floods of October 1955 and March 1980 were bigger. But this flood had something the others didn't. The Blenheim-Gilboa Dam releasing water at historic rates. 12 hours before the bridge collapsed, the rush of water through the pumped storage power project hit an all-time high. To cope with the overload, operators released water into Schoharie Creek according to the rate at which it was entering the reservoir from upstream. They were adding to a creek already in flood stage. Peak discharges exceeded 70,000 cubic feet per second at monitoring stations upstream of the bridge site. By dawn on April 5, Schoharie Creek was a raging torrent. Witnesses later testified the creek, normally just 6 feet deep, was running more than 10 feet above flood level, about 25 feet deep. The velocity was extraordinary. 4.6 meters per second. 15.1 feet per second. The hydraulic force is unprecedented in the bridge's operational history. And beneath the surface, where the water moved fastest, where the turbulence was greatest, the erosion accelerated. Now here's where the engineering gets critical. Understanding why Pier 3 failed requires understanding the geology and hydraulics. The foundation of Pier 3 was bearing on erodible soil. Layers of gravel, sand, and silt, interbedded with folded and tilted till. This geology allowed high-velocity floodwaters to penetrate the bearing stratum. The area left around the footing due to excavation had been backfilled with erodible soil and topped off with dry riprap, rather than being filled completely with riprap stone as it should have been. Schoharie Creek makes an approximate 120-degree bend to the left looking downstream toward the bridge site. This curve in the river directed higher velocity flow toward Pier 3, the pier with significant submergence closest to the outside of the bend. A physical hydraulic model study commissioned after the collapse and conducted at Colorado State University revealed exactly what happened. The model was constructed at a non-distorted scale of 1 to 50 using clear water and sandbed to observe the failure progression. Measurements of the flow field approaching the bridge model showed that maximum velocity coincided with the location of Pier 3. Once the flat face of the Pier 3 spread footing was exposed to the flow, it generated a large horseshoe vortex that accentuated local scour around the pier nose. The water was digging fast, deep, creating a hole approximately 9.8 feet deep and 25 to 30 feet wide beneath the upstream end of Pier 3. The Thornton-Tomasetti investigation found 6 items that aggravated the tendency for scour. First, the flood was greater than that anticipated by the designers. Second, the flood followed the 1955 flood and others that had already disturbed the riprap. Third, the curve in the river upstream directed higher velocity flow toward Pier 3. Fourth, drift material caught against the piers directed water downward at the base of Pier 3. Fifth, berms built in 1963 directed floodwaters under the bridge. And sixth, an embankment west of the creek channel increased flood velocities. There was also another factor. The Mohawk River Dam downstream was set for winter conditions and was 3 meters, 10 feet, lower than in the 1955 flood. This increased the hydraulic gradient, meaning water flowed faster because there was less backwater effect from the downstream river. All of these factors combined to create hydraulic conditions that exceeded anything the bridge had experienced. The spread footing, designed to rest on firm soil, was hanging in space, unsupported, cantilevered over a void 9.8 feet deep. At 10:28 a.m., the concrete couldn't take it anymore. Eyewitnesses observed that the third pier from the west abutment, Pier 3, failed first. Photos taken the day of the event show that the nose of Pier 3 had fallen relative to its tail, which seemed to remain in position. The single concrete column at the nose of Pier 3 lost support, causing that column to buckle. The 2 spans supported by Pier 3, each weighing thousands of tons, dropped into the swollen creek. One eyewitness who lived near the bridge told reporters, "Sounded like lightning struck when the bridge went out, then it just collapsed from there." William Yerkiewicz, who lived on a farm near the bridge, saw the second section fall into the creek 90 minutes after the initial collapse. "It sounded like a bomb going off. You saw dust all coming up and everything." Future Congressman Paul Tonko was driving nearby that morning. "I was driving up from Schoharie County to Montgomery County. I never will forget hearing the thunderous sound and wondered what it was. I had a choice to either go Fonda to the thruway or Amsterdam to the thruway. I was coming up to go to Amsterdam on the thruway. You think of the moment for these folks who perished. It's very stirring when you think of it because any of us, if we changed our patterns that day, could have maybe been near or in that scene. But for the people on the bridge when Pier 3 failed, there was no time to think. No time to react. No warning. A 60-foot section of the 540-foot-long bridge fell approximately 80 feet into the creek. 4 passenger cars and 1 tractor semi-trailer plunged into the rain-swollen water. Just imagine it. You're driving 70 miles per hour. Easter Sunday morning. Maybe you're thinking about the family gathering ahead. The kids in the back seat. The baby shower you're heading to. Then the road vanishes. No guardrails breaking away. No rumble strips. No warning signs. Just nothing. Empty space where pavement should be. If you were in the right lane, you went straight into the gap. If you were far enough back, you had maybe 2 seconds to react, to slam the brakes, to try to stop. At 70 miles per hour, you're traveling 102.67 feet per second. The gap was 60 feet wide. You had 0.58 seconds to realize the road was gone. Nobody made it. What happened next demonstrated just how catastrophically the first failure had compromised the remaining structure. 90 minutes after Pier 3 collapsed, as emergency responders were arriving on scene, Pier 2 failed. The NTSB investigation concluded that the wreckage of Pier 3 and the 2 spans partially blocked the river, redirecting water to Pier 2 and increasing the stream velocity around that pier. The same hydraulic forces that destroyed Pier 3 now concentrated on Pier 2. An on-site news team recorded this event on videotape. The footage showed a sudden and catastrophic drop at the tail end of the second pier. The span immediately west of Pier 2 fell into the creek. Now 3 spans were gone. 3 gaping holes in the interstate. The bridge reduced from 540 feet of continuous roadway to fragments separated by voids dropping 80 feet into raging water. Traffic had to be rerouted immediately. The segment of New York Route 5S near Fort Hunter was reconfigured to carry westbound throughway traffic while plans for bridge reconstruction began. But the disaster wasn't finished yet. 6 days after the Schoharie Creek Bridge fell, on April 11, 1987, a large section of the Mill Point Bridge located about 5 kilometers, 3 miles, upstream of the Schoharie Creek Bridge collapsed. Fortunately, the bridge had been closed since the flood. The New York State Department of Transportation feared its foundation had also been eroded. Nobody was on the structure when it fell. No additional casualties. But think about what this reveals. 2 bridges on the same creek. Both destroyed by the same flood. Both undermined by scour erosion. Both victims of inadequate foundation design and poor maintenance. How many other bridges on Schoharie Creek were at risk? How many bridges across New York State? How many bridges across America? The Mill Point collapse didn't make national headlines because nobody died. But it should have terrified every state transportation department in the country. Because it proved the Schoharie Creek Bridge wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic failure. 10 people died in Schoharie Creek that Sunday morning. Let's take a moment and remember them. Because they weren't statistics. They were people. Families. Lives cut short by bureaucratic negligence and engineering failures. Mary Louise Peck, 47 years old, and her daughter Kristen Jean Peck, 22, were traveling in a westbound lane from their home in Northumberland. They were going to a baby shower. A celebration of new life. They drowned in 25 feet of water when their car was swept downstream and submerged. Willard Peck, Mary Louise's son and Kristen's brother, would later become Northumberland town supervisor. Decades after the disaster, he told reporters, "It was a tragedy. A day doesn't go by where I don't think about it. The positive things that came from it were the awareness of a decaying infrastructure in bridges and roads in the US and stepped-up inspections and rebuilds." John D. Ninham, 39 years old, from Wisconsin, was driving a tractor-trailer loaded with wood pulp, heading from Green Bay to Goshen in Orange County. The massive truck went into the creek when the span collapsed. The rear of the semi-trailer stuck out of the water the next day, visible in the photographs that newspapers would run on front pages across America. 3 men returning from a bowling tournament. 2 Shriners who had gone to a black tie dinner and were heading home to Toronto. A married couple driving to Texas. All of them made one simple decision that morning. Take the thruway. The main highway. The safe route. The route maintained by the state. Inspected annually. Trusted by millions. That decision killed them. Montgomery County Emergency Services received the first calls at 10:30 a.m., 2 minutes after the collapse. Initial reports were confused. Fragmentary. A bridge collapse. Vehicles in the water. Unknown number of casualties. First responders arrived to find chaos. The remaining spans of the bridge still standing, creating a jagged gap in the interstate. Traffic backed up in both directions. And below, in the roiling floodwaters of Schoharie Creek, vehicles being swept downstream. Fire departments from Amsterdam, Fort Hunter, and Schoharie responded. State police, ambulances, dive teams, everyone who could help. But they faced an impossible situation. The creek was still in full flood. Water velocity of 4.6 meters per second meant current too strong for divers to enter safely. The water too murky to see. The depth too great for easy access. 25 feet of churning brown water carrying debris, tree branches, mud. They could only watch and wait for the water to recede. By Monday, April 6th, the floodwaters had dropped enough to begin recovery operations. Divers entered the frigid water. State Police Trooper Raymond Marshall searched the Schoharie Creek shoreline while Sergeant John Curry used an audio device to detect for movement in one of the bridge supports, listening for any sign that someone might have survived. Trapped in an air pocket. Waiting for rescue. They found no survivors. One by one, they found the victims. Montgomery County divers carried blankets to cover a hand sticking out of a passenger window after they righted an auto from its position in the creek. The photographs are haunting. Rescue workers removing bodies from the creek. Police working to extract vehicles. Dive teams searching for additional victims 4 days after the collapse. The recovery operation continued for over a week. Every victim was eventually found. All 10. Families notified. Lives shattered. The front page of the Times-Union on April 6, 1987 reported the collapse with photographs that shocked the region. A major interstate bridge, part of the New York State thruway system, lying in pieces in a swollen creek. The Syracuse Herald-Journal ran the headline, "Body found in collapse of bridge. More feared dead in thruway tragedy." The next day, probers didn't inspect 2 bridge piers last April. How could this happen? Everyone wanted to know. How could a bridge on the main highway, inspected regularly, just collapse without warning? The National Transportation Safety Board began their investigation immediately. The NTSB investigation was thorough, brutal, unflinching in its criticism of the New York State Thruway Authority, the New York State Department of Transportation, and the Federal Highway Administration. Multiple engineering teams were commissioned. The Thruway Authority hired Wyss, Janney, Elsner Associates of Northbrook, Illinois, and Musa Rutledge Consulting Engineers of New York City to investigate. The NTSB conducted its own study. A 4th investigation was undertaken by Thornton Tomasetti for the New York State Disaster Preparedness Commission. The teams cooperated. They shared data. They performed complementary analyses. And they all reached the same conclusion. Scour undermined piers 2 and 3, leading to catastrophic failure. The physical evidence was damning. A hole approximately 9.8 feet deep and 25 to 30 feet long had formed beneath Pier 3. The spread footing simply slid into the hole. Without piles driven deep into bedrock, without adequate riprap protection, the pier had no chance. The NTSB's final determination was unequivocal. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the collapse of the Schoharie Creek Bridge was the failure of the New York State Thruway Authority to maintain adequate riprap around the bridge piers, which led to severe erosion in the soil beneath the spread footings. Contributing to the accident were ambiguous plans and specifications used for construction of the bridge, an inadequate NYSTA bridge inspection program, and inadequate oversight by the New York State Department of Transportation and the Federal Highway Administration. Let's break down what went wrong. Because this wasn't one mistake. This was a cascade of failures. Each one preventable. Each one ignored. First, the design. The shallow footings used, bearing on soil, could be undermined. The depth of the footings was not enough to take them below the probable limit of scour. The NTSB concluded that the maximum scour depth observed at the bridge site was 9 feet below the bottom of the footing of Pier 3. However, since the safety board could not be certain how deep the scour hole at Pier 3 may have become had spans 3 and 4 not fallen when they did, it was not possible to conclude definitively whether piles driven in accordance with the AASHTO recommendations for pile depths would have prevented the bridge collapse. But then they added, certainly, if piles were driven deeply enough, the piers would not have lost their support. Therefore, the safety board concludes that had the Schoharie Creek Bridge been designed with piles to protect against scour, the collapse might not have occurred, depending on how deeply the piles were driven below the footings. Might not have occurred, depending on pile depth. That uncertainty should haunt every bridge engineer. The original design specifications called for steel sheet piling to be left in place after construction to protect piers 2 and 3 from scour. It wasn't done. The sheet piling was removed. The as-built plans didn't reflect the true condition of the bridge. They showed sheet piling in place. It was gone. Second, the riprap. The design specification called for riprap with 50% of the stones heavier than 1.3 kilonewtons, 290 pounds force, and the remainder between 0.44 and 1.3 kilonewtons, 99 and 292 pounds force. Investigators found that heavier riprap weights of 4.4 to 6.7 kilonewtons, 990 to 1,510 pounds force, should have been specified. The riprap that was installed was too light. At the hydraulic velocities experienced during floods, stones weighing 300 pounds were simply picked up and carried downstream. The floods of 1955 and subsequent high water events washed it away. By 1979, most of it was gone. By 1987, Pier 3 was essentially unprotected. The NTSB concluded that had the piers been protected by riprap at the time of the April 1987 flood as they were during the 1955 flood, the bridge probably would not have collapsed. Probably. That word again. 10 lives. Probably preventable. Third, the inspections. The NTSB was scathing in its criticism. Although the Schoharie Creek Bridge had been inspected annually or biennially since 1968, an underwater inspection of the pier's footings had never been performed. Never. Not once in 33 years. The bridge was scheduled for an underwater inspection in 1987, but the bridge collapsed before the inspection took place. One inspector testified he gave passing grades to footings he never looked at. He assumed they were on piles. He never checked. Never verified. Never questioned. The Thornton-Tomasetti report stated, where riprap is used to prevent scour, inspection and restoration of protective riprap should be performed after every significant flood to avoid progressive damage, and the replacement stones used should be heavier than those which were observed to shift. Every significant flood. The bridge had survived multiple floods between 1955 and 1987. The 1955 flood of 76,500 cubic feet per second. The March 1980 flood. The floods of 1974 and 1975. Multiple high water events in 1980. After each one, inspectors should have been in the water, checking riprap, measuring scour depth, replacing displaced stones with heavier ones. They never did. The NTSB issued recommendations that the manual for bridge maintenance be amended to strongly caution users that the chart on page 160, which provided a rough guide to the selection of adequate stone size at bridge crossings, was probably inadequate to ensure that all the riprap would remain in place under the average velocities listed. Probably inadequate. The manual that inspectors relied on was probably inadequate. And nobody questioned it for 33 years. Fourth, the oversight. The Federal Highway Administration was supposed to provide oversight of state bridge inspection programs. They failed. The New York State Department of Transportation was supposed to monitor the Thruway Authority's inspection practices. They failed. Multiple levels of bureaucracy, all of them failing simultaneously, all of them abdicating their responsibility to protect public safety. The NTSB found inadequate oversight by the New York State Department of Transportation and the Federal Highway Administration as contributing factors to the accident. Everyone was supposed to be watching. Nobody was watching. The New York State Commission of Investigation denounced the New York State Thruway Authority for an inadequate bridge inspection program. The authority was criticized for, among other things, an April 1986 inspection that failed to evaluate the condition of the riprap. The price of the disaster was approximately $45 million, including the cost of building the new bridge, rerouting traffic around the remains of the old one, and lost toll revenue. In addition, New York State and the New York State Thruway Authority faced 24 lawsuits filed by family members of the victims, insurers, and others for more than $42 million. The lawsuits were settled out of court. By the early 1990s, approximately $4 million had been paid to victims' families. $4 million. $400,000 per life. No criminal charges were filed. Not against the inspectors who falsified reports. Not against the supervisors who failed to require underwater inspections. Not against the administrators who ignored the Scour-Critical classification for 13 years. Nobody went to jail. Nobody lost their professional license. Nobody faced criminal prosecution for negligence that killed 10 people. The only accountability was financial. Settlements paid with taxpayer money. Not from the personal assets of the people responsible. The public paid twice. Once in lives lost, and again in settlements and reconstruction costs. But something did change. Something had to change. In the aftermath of the Schoharie Creek disaster, the federal government and state departments of transportation across America overhauled their bridge inspection programs. In February 1991, the Federal Highway Administration issued Hydraulic Engineering Circular, HEC, number 18, evaluating scour at bridges. The document provided detailed guidance on scour assessment, foundation design, riprap specifications, and inspection protocols. The circular mandated that all bridges over waterways be evaluated for scour potential. Over 500,000 U.S. bridges were assessed under the new guidelines. Bridges classified as Scour-Critical required enhanced inspection procedures, including underwater inspection of foundations at least annually, immediate post-flood inspection, continuous monitoring during flood events when possible, documentation of riprap condition and scour depth, and immediate closure if unsafe conditions were detected. New York State implemented comprehensive changes to bridge design and inspection. All new bridges over waterways were required to have foundations extending below the maximum anticipated scour depth. Existing bridges were evaluated and retrofitted where necessary. Inspection personnel were required to be professional engineers or work under direct supervision of licensed engineers. The New York State Department of Transportation says both the state and federal government enacted changes to construction, maintenance and inspection of highway bridges following the tragedy over Schoharie Creek. Bridge inspectors nationwide were trained to recognize scour potential, to understand that the presence of some riprap does not necessarily make a bridge safe from scour, to know when riprap is missing and the significance of that condition. The disaster brought national attention to America's aging infrastructure. Congressman Paul Tonko, who heard the bridge collapse that morning, would later use the disaster to advocate for infrastructure investment. Since then we've had many floodings in the area and they've come about with peculiar storms, atypical storms that keep mounting in number, 100-year storms that are happening every other year that defy the nomenclature. The Schoharie Creek Bridge collapse motivated improvements in bridge design and inspection procedures within New York and beyond. Every state revised their inspection protocols. Every bridge over water was re-evaluated. Federal funding priorities shifted toward bridge rehabilitation. But it shouldn't have taken 10 deaths. The replacement bridge was completed and fully open to traffic on May 21, 1988. 13 months after the collapse. Rush construction. Round-the-clock work. Temporary detours costing the state millions in lost toll revenue. The new bridge incorporated every lesson learned from the disaster. Deep pile foundations extending far below maximum anticipated scour depth. Heavy riprap protection properly sized for the hydraulic forces. Structural redundancy so failure of one component wouldn't cause total collapse. Enhanced monitoring systems. Parallel spans so even if one side failed, traffic could continue on the other side. Everything the original bridge should have been. The cost was $32.5 million. Remember, the original bridge was built with the cheaper of two designs. The state saved money in 1952 by choosing the 540-foot option over the 600-foot option. How much did they save? How much was the cost difference? The records don't specify. But it was almost certainly less than the combined cost of the replacement bridge, the lawsuits, the lost revenue, and the reputational damage. False economy. Short-term thinking. Prioritizing budget savings over long-term safety. And 10 people paid with their lives. If you're watching this video, you probably drive over bridges regularly. Interstate highways. State routes. Local roads crossing rivers and streams. You trust that those bridges are safe. That they're properly designed. That they're inspected regularly. That someone is paying attention. The Schoharie Creek Bridge collapse teaches us that trust can be misplaced. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, approximately 42% of American bridges are at least 50 years old. Many were designed using standards that are now considered inadequate. Many have foundations that don't extend below maximum scour depth. Many rely on riprap protection that may or may not still be in place. How many bridges are classified as Scour-Critical today? How many have underwater inspections deferred due to budget constraints? How many have warnings sitting in filing cabinets? Unread and ignored. The Baltimore Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed in March 2024 when a container ship struck a pier. 6 construction workers died. The bridge had been standing since 1977. 47 years. The collapse renewed conversations about infrastructure investment and bridge safety. One observer who had lived through the Schoharie disaster wrote, "The bridge collapse in Baltimore, which took the lives of 6 people, has brought me back to the morning of April 5, 1987, when the heavily traveled throughway bridge collapsed into the flooded and raging Schoharie Creek. I was almost on that bridge on that day." Almost. The word that separates life from death. The word that separates the victims from the survivors. Just look at the picture of the collapsed Schoharie Creek Bridge and imagine driving about 70 miles per hour and realizing at some point the road was simply gone. It had fallen into the creek below. Would you have been distracted and not realized? Would you have been going too fast to stop? How would you have reacted? It's frightful to think about what was going on in the minds of those 5 drivers on that Sunday morning in April of 1987. Willard Peck, who lost his mother and sister in the collapse, said it best, "A day doesn't go by where I don't think about it. A day doesn't go by. 37 years later. The pain doesn't fade. The what-ifs never stop." What if the inspector had actually looked at the footings? What if the 1974 report hadn't been filed away? What if the 1979 consultant's warning about missing riprap had triggered corrective action? What if the underwater inspection scheduled for 1987 had been conducted 4 months earlier? What if someone, anyone, had taken the Scour-Critical classification seriously? 10 people would have made it to their destinations that Easter Sunday. Mary Louise and Kristen would have attended the baby shower. John Ninham would have delivered his load of wood pulp. 3 friends would have returned home from their bowling tournament. 2 Shriners would have made it back to Toronto. The married couple would have reached Texas. All of them would have lived. Instead, they became a case study. A cautionary tale. A disaster that changed how America inspects its bridges. If you found this story important, if you think more people need to understand how infrastructure failures happen, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories of engineering disasters, institutional failures, and the lessons we must learn to prevent future tragedies. After the collapse, the investigating engineering team commissioned a detailed physical model study at the hydraulics laboratory at Colorado State University. The goal was to understand exactly what happened beneath the surface, to recreate the hydraulic conditions that produced the catastrophic scour. The model was constructed at a non-distorted scale of 1 to 50 using clear water and sand bed to allow observation of the failure progression. Engineers formed the topography in sand and topped the land features with a mortar cover to fix them in place. However, the creek channel was modeled in sand compacted and formed to match the creek cross-sections obtained from maps of the site. The Froude criterion was used to determine the geometric scale of the model. This ensured that the flow dynamics in the model accurately represented the full-scale conditions at the bridge site. The model allowed researchers to visualize what had been invisible during the actual flood. They could watch as high-velocity water concentrated around Pier 3. They could observe the horseshoe vortex forming at the nose of the pier. They could measure scour depth in real time. The study confirmed that the location of Pier 3, on the outside of the 120-degree bend, placed it directly in the path of maximum flow velocity. The curved creek channel acted like a funnel, concentrating water and accelerating it toward the pier. They also discovered that once scour exposed the flat face of the spread footing, the hydraulic forces increased dramatically. The footing itself became an obstruction that generated additional turbulence, accelerating the very erosion that was undermining it. A feedback loop of destruction. The Colorado State model became a reference case for bridge scour research. It's still used today in engineering schools to teach students about hydraulic forces and foundation design. The United States Geological Survey conducted its own analysis of the flood conditions. They constructed a two-dimensional finite element surface water flow model to obtain detailed descriptions of water surface elevations and depth averaged velocities within a reach extending from about 4,000 feet downstream of the bridge to about 6,000 feet upstream. The USGS study confirmed that the flood produced extreme water surface elevations and velocities in the creek, leading to scour depths far exceeding the pier foundation's capacity. Bed material removal was estimated at several feet around the critical piers. The analysis revealed that peak discharges of approximately 62,000 cubic feet per second created flow velocities of 4.6 meters per second, 15.1 feet per second, around Pier 3. At those velocities, stones weighing 300 pounds could be moved. Sand and gravel was simply stripped away. The USGS report noted that Schoharie Creek has a long history of flash flooding due to its steep gradients, narrow valleys, and susceptibility to rapid runoff from intense storms. The watershed characteristics made the creek particularly prone to rapid rises during heavy rainfall or snowmelt events. The 1987 flood was not unprecedented in terms of discharge. The 1955 flood had been larger, but the combination of factors, the deteriorated riprap, the exposed footings, the curve in the creek directing maximum flow toward Pier 3, created conditions that the bridge could not survive. One aspect of the investigation that deserves special attention is the lack of structural redundancy. The NTSB noted this as a contributing factor to the severity of the accident. The bridge was designed with simply supported spans. Each span rested independently on the piers beneath it. When Pier 3 failed, there was no backup system, no alternate load path, no way for adjacent spans to share the load. The bearing system allowed the spans to lift or slide off the concrete piers. Once Pier 3 began to fail, the spans it supported simply fell, and the wreckage created additional problems by redirecting water toward Pier 2. Modern bridge design incorporates redundancy, continuous spans, multiple load paths, systems that can redistribute loads if one component fails. The idea is that a bridge should degrade gradually, showing warning signs, rather than collapsing catastrophically. The Schoharie Creek Bridge had no such redundancy. When the foundation failed, everything failed, instantly, with no warning. This is why the replacement bridge was designed with parallel structures. If one side experiences problems, traffic can continue on the other side while repairs are made. It's belt and suspenders engineering. Expensive, but necessary. The chief engineer's 1974 report sat in a filing cabinet for 13 years. The 1979 consultant's report noting missing riprap was filed away. The inspection reports that falsely certified footing conditions were stored with all the others. Paper doesn't save lives. Reports don't prevent disasters. Documentation is worthless if nobody reads it, if nobody acts on it, if nobody takes responsibility for implementing the recommendations. The Schoharie Creek Bridge collapse wasn't caused by lack of knowledge. Engineers understood scour. The risks were documented. The classifications were in place. The inspection protocols existed. The collapse was caused by institutional apathy, by budget constraints prioritized over safety, by inspectors who didn't inspect, by supervisors who didn't supervise, by administrators who didn't administrate, by oversight agencies that didn't oversee. It was caused by people who assumed someone else was handling it, by people who thought it would probably be fine, by people who didn't want to spend the money, by people who didn't think it would happen on their watch. 10 people died because probably isn't good enough, because assumptions kill, because deferred maintenance compounds into catastrophe. The next time you cross a bridge, remember Schoharie Creek. Remember that the bridge beneath you is only as safe as the last inspection, only as strong as the last maintenance work, only as reliable as the people responsible for its care. Remember Mary Louise and Kristen Peck heading to a baby shower. Remember John Ninham just doing his job hauling wood pulp across the country. Remember the 3 friends returning from bowling. Remember the Shriners heading home. Remember the couple driving to Texas. Remember that they trusted the bridge. They trusted the system. They trusted that someone was paying attention. And the bridge betrayed that trust. The Schoharie Creek Bridge collapsed on April 5, 1987. The replacement bridge opened on May 21, 1988. Today, if you drive Interstate 90 across Schoharie Creek, you'll cross a bridge built with deep pile foundations, proper riprap protection, structural redundancy, and regular underwater inspections. A bridge built the way the original should have been. A bridge designed by engineers who learned from disaster. A bridge that honors the memory of 10 people who shouldn't have died. The report sat unread for 13 years. 10 people paid the price. Don't let that happen again.